The boy says goodbye to his stillborn brother, but suddenly the whole ward stops from his scream. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments, what city are you from? We appreciate your support. The house buzzed with quiet anticipation, filled with the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the distant chirping of cicadas outside the window. Sunlight streamed through the cream-colored curtains, casting a warm, golden glow over the living room. A small pair of hands carefully arranged a collection of stuffed animals on the couch. The largest, a slightly worn but well-loved teddy bear, took center stage. Jaden, just 6 years old, stood back to inspect his work. His deep brown eyes sparkled with pride as he imagined introducing these fluffy friends to his baby brother. For months, he had been dreaming about this moment, playing together, sharing his favorite toys, and having someone to teach all his little secrets. His excitement was the pure, boundless joy that only a child could know. In the adjacent room, his mother, Sarah, carefully folded tiny baby clothes, soft onesies, colorful bibs, and little socks no bigger than her thumb. She was a woman whose presence radiated warmth and grace. Her dark, curly hair was tied up, a few strands falling loose over her forehead as she worked. She paused for a moment, pressing her hand against her swollen belly as if to soothe the restless life within her. A smile touched her lips, a smile of hope, love, and perhaps a flicker of fatigue that she quickly brushed aside. Jaden soon appeared in the doorway, his small figure silhouetted by the afternoon light. He held the teddy bear tightly in his arms, his expression curious and full of wonder. He watched his mother folding the impossibly small clothes, and his voice, soft but eager, broke the silence. Sarah's heart swelled at her son's curiosity. His excitement had been a constant source of joy throughout her pregnancy. Every evening, he would rest his head against her belly, whispering little stories to his unborn brother, tales of dinosaurs, space adventures, and pirate treasures. And sometimes, as if in reply, a gentle kick would meet his hand, sparking his laughter and filling the house with warmth. Their family was tight-knit, built on love and resilience. Sarah worked as a dedicated school teacher, her days spent nurturing other children's minds while eagerly awaiting the arrival of her second child. Her husband, Daniel, was a hard-working manager at a local transport company. He often came home late, but his love for his family was unwavering, visible in every shared meal, every bedtime story, and every promise whispered to Sarah's belly. But in recent days, a shadow of unease had begun to creep into their home. Sarah had felt it, small cramps, moments of dizziness. Nothing severe enough to cause alarm, but enough to make her pause. She had brushed them aside, chalking it up to the strain of pregnancy. Jaden, however, sensed more than he understood. Children often feel the tremors of an approaching storm before they see its clouds. His eyes, wide and observant, would linger on his mother a little longer, his hugs holding a little tighter. That evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and lavender, Sarah felt a sharp movement within her belly. She gasped softly, and Jaden, ever attentive, hurried to her side, his tiny hand pressing eagerly against her stomach. A small kick greeted his palm, and his face lit up with joy. His laughter, pure and infectious, filled the room, easing the fleeting tension that had passed across Sarah's face. Moments later, the sound of the front door unlocking announced Daniel's arrival. His broad frame appeared in the hallway, his suit slightly rumpled from a long day. His eyes, warm and kind, softened further as he saw his family. That night, as Sarah tucked Jaden into bed, he whispered to her through a sleepy haze, "I'll protect him, Mom. I promise." Sarah's heart ached with tenderness. She kissed his forehead softly and whispered back, "I know you will, sweetheart. You'll be the best big brother." The house settled into the peaceful stillness of night. Yet, beneath the calm surface, something unseen was stirring, something that would test the strength of this family's love and the depth of a brother's promise. Jaden slept soundly, his small arms curled around the teddy bear, unaware that soon his promise would mean more than he could ever imagine. The summer evening carried a comforting stillness, the kind that usually brought peace after a long day. The neighborhood was quiet, the distant hum of cicadas blending with the soft rhythm of the ceiling fan. Inside their cozy home, the warm scent of baked chicken and cornbread lingered in the air. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, something unseen brewed, something that would forever change their lives. Jaden sat cross-legged on the living room floor, his little hands guiding a line of toy cars along an imaginary racetrack. His face, smooth and round, glowed with innocent joy as he provided sound effects for every sharp turn and daring crash. Behind him, the soft voice of a television announcer played, but he paid no attention. His world was in his hands, between the wheels of his tiny race cars and the excitement of knowing his baby brother would soon join him in his adventures. In the kitchen, Sarah stood at the counter, humming a lullaby she often sang to Jaden when he was a baby. She had always found comfort in simple routines: the sizzle of the pan, the warmth of the oven, the promise of a family meal shared together. Yet, beneath her soft melody, a tension had been building inside her body, a dull ache that pulsed low in her belly, something she had been ignoring for days. She paused, one hand pressing against her lower abdomen as a wave of discomfort rolled through her. It passed quickly, and she let out a slow breath, brushing off the momentary pain. It was probably nothing, just the natural strain of late pregnancy. She had felt similar things during Jaden's time. Still, her other hand instinctively gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning pale. Jaden, ever watchful of his mother, glanced up from his cars. His dark eyes, wide with curiosity and a flicker of concern, caught the change in her expression. He didn't understand it fully, but something felt off. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, washing the sky in dusky shades of violet and orange. The living room, once filled with the golden glow of the day, slowly surrendered to shadows. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passing of another evening without Daniel. He was running late again, a common occurrence lately, but one that never failed to make Sarah's heart feel just a bit heavier. In the growing twilight, another sharp pain seized her, more intense than the last. She gasped aloud, and the sound was enough to make Jaden drop his car mid-race. The toy clattered against the hardwood floor as he sprang to his feet. "Mama?" His small voice, lined with confusion and fear, broke through the air. Sarah's legs weakened beneath her, and she reached for the counter but missed. The world tilted. Then, with a crash, a plate slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor. She collapsed to her knees, her breath shallow, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. Jaden's heart pounded, his chest tight with panic. The room felt suddenly too large, too dark. His mother, the strongest person he knew, was on the floor, her face pale and twisted in pain. It was wrong, so wrong. He wanted to scream for help, but there was no one else here, only him. And then, from somewhere deep inside him, something steadied, a small but fierce spark of courage. He remembered what his parents had taught him. In an emergency, stay calm, call for help. He bolted to the coffee table where his mother's phone lay. His small hands trembled as he unlocked it, the screen's glow lighting his worried face. His fingers fumbled, but he found the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? Came a clear voice on the line. Jaden's voice was high and shaking, but he spoke with clarity far beyond his years. My mom, she fell. She's pregnant. She's not okay. Please come fast. The dispatcher's voice, calm and guiding, became his anchor. You're doing so well, sweetheart. Can you stay with her? Is she breathing? Jaden dropped the phone to speaker mode and scrambled back to his mother's side. Mama, I'm here. Please wake up. He touched her face. She was hot and clammy. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, dull and glazed with pain, but she saw him. Her lips parted, her voice weak but urgent. Jaden, so brave, she rasped. Stay with me. Tears blurred his vision, but he nodded fiercely. I'm here. I won't leave you, Mama, I promise. The sirens came first, a distant wail growing louder, faster. Red and blue lights flared through the windows, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. The front door burst open, and paramedics swept in, their uniforms a blur of motion and urgency. Jaden refused to move from her side until strong but gentle hands guided him back, promising to help his mama. He watched as they lifted her onto a stretcher, an oxygen mask slipping over her face. Panic gripped his chest. She looked so fragile, so small. As they wheeled her out, one of the paramedics, a woman with warm eyes, turned to Jaden. Do you want to ride with her? She asked softly. Jaden's head bobbed, his voice barely a whisper. I won't leave her. Inside the ambulance, he clung to her hand, his own so small, yet so determined. Her fingers felt cold, but he squeezed tighter. The vehicle rumbled forward, the sirens screaming against the night. Jaden felt every bump, every jolt, but he never let go. The hospital loomed ahead, its sterile lights harsh against the dark sky. The doors opened, and his mother was whisked inside, the paramedics shouting terms he couldn't understand. Placental abruption, fetal distress, severe bleeding. The words swirled above him, incomprehensible but terrifying. And then, through the chaos, a familiar voice called his name, deep, hoarse, and heavy with fear. Jaden! He turned and saw his father. Daniel's face was tight with panic, his tie loosened, his shirt wrinkled from the rush to get here. The man who was always steady, always composed, looked shattered. Jaden ran to him, and Daniel caught him up in his arms, holding him close as though he could shield him from everything. What happened? Daniel's voice was strained, desperate. Jaden's voice broke on his reply, his small body trembling against his father's chest. She fell. I called. They're helping her, Daddy. Daniel's grip tightened, his throat thick with emotion. You did so good, Jaden. You were so brave. But Jaden's face, tear-streaked and pale, pressed against his father's chest as he whispered, Daddy, I'm scared. Daniel's heart shattered at the sound. His son, their son, had faced a terror that no child should. And yet, he had been a hero. The hallway lights flickered coldly as a doctor in a crisp white coat approached them. Her expression was grave, her voice firm but measured. She's in surgery now. The baby is in distress, and your wife is losing a lot of blood. We're doing everything we can, but time is critical. We may not be able to save both of them. Daniel's knees weakened, the weight of the world crashing down on him. He felt Jaden's small hand in his, warm, steady, trusting. And in that moment, he knew, he had to decide. But how could any man choose between the love of his life and the life they had created together? The night, once peaceful and serene, had turned into a nightmare. The waiting room's ticking clock seemed to scream with every second lost. and as Daniel stood frozen in anguish, Jaden's hand held his tightly, his voice soft but resolute. "She'll be okay, Daddy. She has to be." The night was long, and the storm had only just begun. The hospital air was thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic, and the sterile white lights burned cold overhead. The rhythmic beep of machines and the hurried footsteps of nurses created a chaotic symphony that only deepened the hollow dread in Daniel's chest. The waiting room, lined with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines, felt like a prison. Time no longer passed. It stretched, heavy and cruel. Jaden sat beside him, his small legs swinging nervously above the floor. His tiny hand, still clutching Daniel's, felt warm and fragile. His face, so young and innocent, was tight with worry beyond his years. He kept his eyes fixed on the doors that had swallowed his mother, as though sheer willpower could bring her back. The doors finally opened, and a woman in a white coat approached. She was calm, but carried the gravity of someone who had seen too many families shattered by bad news. Her name tag read Dr. Miriam Blake. She met Daniel's eyes with practiced steadiness, but her voice held no comfort. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone measured but urgent, "your wife has suffered a severe placental abruption. The baby is in distress, and your wife is losing a dangerous amount of blood. We are preparing for an emergency cesarean section, but—" She paused briefly. The next words weighed with unbearable consequence. "There are complications. The situation is critical. If we proceed with full measures to save the baby, we risk losing your wife. If we focus on stabilizing her, we may not be able to save the child." Daniel's world contracted to that single, terrible choice. The air seemed to thin, and the sounds around him dulled into a muted roar. He felt Jaden's hand squeeze his, and in the corner of his vision, he saw his son's wide, frightened eyes looking up at him. Jaden didn't understand the medical terms, but he understood one thing. Something terrible was happening to his mother and brother. His heart pounded, and his voice, small but urgent, broke the silence. "They're going to be okay. Right, Daddy?" Daniel's throat tightened, and he couldn't speak. How could he answer that? How could he make this choice? His mind raced through every possibility, but there was no path without devastation. His wife? His child? The weight of the doctor's gaze pressed on him. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we don't have time. You have to decide now." A cold, crushing agony twisted inside him. His heart screamed against the cruelty of the question, but he knew he had to answer. He saw Sarah's face in his mind, her laughter, her warmth, the way she kissed Jaden goodnight with a tenderness that filled their home with light. And he saw his unborn child, the life they had dreamed of, a tiny heart not yet given a chance to beat outside the womb. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Save. Save Sarah." The words tasted like ash. His chest heaved as the decision escaped his lips, and the moment it did, it felt like his soul had been torn in two. He pulled Jaden close, holding him tightly, as though his small body could anchor him from collapsing under the grief already swelling inside him. Jaden's voice trembled against his chest. "But what about the baby?" Daniel couldn't answer. His throat was locked with sorrow. The doors swung closed behind the doctor, and Daniel was left with the unbearable silence. The minutes that followed were a blur, time no longer real, only the agony of waiting. Jaden remained pressed against him, his warmth the only thing keeping Daniel from shattering completely. Suddenly, the hospital doors burst open again, and a nurse hurried through, her face tense. "We're taking her into surgery now," she called. The world became a swirl of chaos. Nurses rushing, gurneys rolling, monitors screaming. Daniel stood frozen, helpless, every fiber of his being screaming to follow, to do something, but there was nothing he could do. The cold, sterile walls of the waiting room felt like they were closing in. The clock on the wall ticked, every second stretching into eternity. Daniel felt Jaden shift beside him, and when he looked down, he saw his son's face streaked with silent tears. "She'll come back," Jaden whispered, his voice cracking but certain. "And so will the baby." Daniel's heart broke anew. "I hope so, buddy," he whispered, his voice raw. "I hope so." The doors to the operating room remained closed, an impenetrable barrier between them and the fight for two lives. And so they waited. They waited, suspended in a fragile space between hope and devastation. The hospital corridor felt like a tomb, cold, sterile, and suffocatingly quiet. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows that only deepened the hollow ache in Daniel's chest. Time had lost all meaning, fractured into sharp, jagged moments of terror and pleading hope. The waiting room, with its plastic chairs and muted walls, seemed to press in around him and Jaden, their small world shrinking to a single desperate wish. The doors to the operating room burst open with a metallic clang. Dr. Miriam emerged, her surgical mask pulled down, her face pale and tight with exhaustion. Her eyes, clouded with a sadness Daniel recognized instantly, met his. His stomach plummeted. "She's stable," the doctor began, her voice careful, weighed down by the gravity of what followed. "But—" She hesitated for the briefest of moments, and it was in that crack of silence that Daniel felt his heart split. "The baby?" She paused again, her voice lowering to a whisper. "I'm so sorry. He didn't make it." The world stopped. The air seemed to vanish from the room, leaving Daniel in a vacuum where nothing existed but the pounding of his heart and the crushing weight of those words. He heard the muffled sob of a nurse behind him, the distant hum of machines, but it was all background to the deafening roar of grief flooding his chest. His legs weakened, and he had to brace himself against the wall as his knees threatened to give out. Beside him, Jaden froze, his small hand tightening around his father's. His breath quickened, and his eyes, wide and disbelieving, shot up to Daniel's face, searching desperately for something, anything, to contradict the doctor's words. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling, a crack in the dam of his innocence. "No, that's not right. He was supposed to come home. I promised." His voice broke, and with it, the first sob ripped from his throat, raw and wounded. Daniel dropped to his knees, pulling Jaden into his arms as his own tears, hot and uncontainable, streamed down his face. They clung to each other, father and son, their bodies shaken with a shared grief too large for words. Minutes passed, an eternity carved from anguish, before a nurse approached softly. "Would you like to see him?" she asked, her voice gentle but trembling. Daniel felt his soul fracture at the question, but he nodded. Beside him, Jaden's head lifted, his tear-streaked face suddenly resolute. "I want to see my brother," he said, his voice small but steady. I need to." The nurse's eyes softened with sadness and understanding. "Follow me." They were led into a dim room, quiet and still, where the air felt impossibly heavy. On a small hospital bassinet lay the tiny form, swaddled in a soft white blanket. He looked impossibly small, his features delicate, his skin dusky and still. His little hands, barely larger than Jaden's thumb, rested gently on his chest. Sarah lay nearby, pale and weak but awake. Her eyes, sunken from pain and tears, lifted as they entered. The devastation in her face was total, and when she saw them, her husband and her son, Her lips trembled and her voice barely escaped. "Our baby." Daniel crossed the room, his knees threatening to buckle as he approached the bassinet. His hands trembled as they reached down, brushing the baby's soft cheek, still warm, but far too still. "I'm so sorry," he choked, his voice barely a whisper, broken and raw. I wanted to keep you safe." Jaden, his face tight with confusion and pain, stepped closer. Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice quivering. Daniel hesitated, his eyes flickering to Dr. Miriam, who gave the smallest of nods. Carefully, with infinite tenderness, Daniel lifted the tiny bundle and placed his lifeless brother into Jaden's waiting arms. Jaden's hands were small but steady, his arms cradling the fragile weight as though he could shelter him from the silence that had stolen his breath. Tears streamed freely down his cheeks as he gazed down at his brother's peaceful, still face. "Hey, little guy," he whispered, his voice breaking into a sob. I'm your big brother. I'm supposed to protect you. I promised I would. I promised." His voice cracked and he rocked his brother gently, his small body trembling with grief too large for his years. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His tears splashed onto the tiny blanket, and his little fingers stroked the baby's cold cheek. "Please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "Come back. Don't leave me. Please." The room was filled with the quiet, broken sobs of a child who loved his brother beyond words, beyond life. The air seemed frozen in sorrow, every heartbeat slow and heavy, and then a sound. So faint, so fragile it barely pierced the veil of grief. A tiny gasp, ragged, weak, but unmistakably real. Jaden's breath caught, his teary eyes widened in shock. Daddy," he stammered, his voice trembling. He... A second gasp, then the smallest, most delicate cry, a whisper of life that shattered the silence like a lightning strike through darkness. The room, frozen in grief, erupted into chaos. Dr. Miriam surged forward, her voice suddenly sharp and urgent. "Oh my God, we have a heartbeat. He's breathing." The bassinet was a blur of motion. Hands, wires, a rush of machines. "Get me an oxygen mask. Stat!" she barked to the nurses. Daniel staggered backward, his face pale with shock. He was gone." His voice failed him, his knees nearly giving way beneath him. He clutched Sarah's hand, his entire body trembling. "Sarah, he's..." Sarah's eyes, wide and overflowing, stared in disbelief. Her lips trembled, her voice a whisper. He's alive." Jaden stood frozen, his tear-streaked face illuminated by something beyond shock, something fierce, something pure. His little chest heaved, his voice barely audible but burning with truth. I told you. He just needed me." The room filled with frantic sounds, the soft hiss of oxygen, the hurried commands of nurses, the rapid beeping of a newly awakened heartbeat. But beneath it all, a miracle had already happened. A brother had kept his promise. And life, against every impossible, unforgiven odd, had answered. The room, once a tomb of sorrow, had erupted into frantic, chaotic life. Nurses rushed around the bassinet, voices sharp and urgent, their hands swift but precise. The soft, rhythmic beep of a monitor now echoed through the room. A heartbeat, steady and real. The newborn's tiny chest rose and fell in fragile, shallow breaths, each one a defiance against death itself. Jaden stood frozen where he was, his arms still trembling from where he had cradled his brother, his face streaked with tears. His heart thundered in his chest, and his breath came in short, shaky bursts. He felt the warmth still on his hands, the warmth from his baby brother, who just moments ago had been cold and still. But now he was breathing. A warm hand rested on Jaden's shoulder, and he looked up to see his father's face, pale and tear-streaked but lit with something raw and luminous. Hope. Daniel's voice was choked, barely a whisper. You did it, buddy. He's alive." Dr. Miriam, her composure cracked but her focus sharp, hovered over the baby. Her gloved hands moved swiftly as she placed an oxygen mask over the newborn's tiny mouth and nose. "He's breathing on his own," she announced, her voice edged with disbelief and urgency. "But it's shallow. We need to stabilize him. Get me a warming unit and an IV line, now." A nurse rushed forward, placing a small warming pad beneath the infant as another prepared a tiny catheter for the IV. The baby let out another sound, still faint, still weak, but stronger than before. A cry. Jaden's breath hitched. "He's crying," he whispered, his voice trembling with awe. Sarah, pale and barely able to lift her head from the pillow, reached out, her fingers trembling. Let me see him." She rasped, her voice thin with exhaustion and raw with emotion. Daniel's arm tightened protectively around Jaden, but his gaze shot to Dr. Miriam. The doctor's eyes, for the first time, softened from their clinical edge. "Just a moment," she said firmly. "Let me confirm his vitals." She bent close to the tiny body, her stethoscope pressing against the fragile chest. The room was thick with tension, every person holding their breath as if afraid that the smallest sound could break the delicate thread of life that had so impossibly returned. Dr. Miriam's lips pressed into a thin line as she listened. Seconds passed like lifetimes. Then she lifted her head, her expression shifting from disbelief to something like awe. "His heartbeat is steady," she announced, her voice softer now, almost reverent. "Weak, but steady. He's fighting." She straightened, her eyes meeting Daniel's, then Sarah's, then, finally, Jaden's. "I don't understand how, but he's here. He's alive." A sob broke from Sarah's throat, and her hand, still trembling, covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "My baby." Daniel's knees nearly buckled, and he sank into the chair beside Sarah's bed, his hand finding hers and gripping it tightly. He's here," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Oh, God, he's here." Jaden, still standing, his small chest heaving with emotion, spoke softly but clearly. "I told him I'd protect him." His voice, though young, carried a power far older, a vow fulfilled. "I told him he wasn't alone." The room, though still buzzing with medical urgency, seemed to hold its breath around that truth. Dr. Miriam's voice, still edged with professional control, softened further as she spoke again. "I've seen a lot of things in my career," she said, her eyes flicking from the newborn to Jaden. "But I've never seen this." She turned toward the family, her hands pulling away her gloves with a faint snap. "He had no vital signs. We checked. He was gone." She paused, her brow furrowed in wonder. "But somehow, he came back." A nurse, her voice soft but full of something almost sacred, offered, "Sometimes, skin-to-skin contact can trigger miracles and preemies. We call it the kangaroo method, using warmth, heartbeat, and love to stabilize fragile infants." She looked down at Jaden with a smile that was half wonder, half gratitude. "But this is beyond anything I've seen." Jaden's eyes were still locked on his brother, his heart too full to understand the science, but something deep inside him knew the truth. "He just needed me," he said softly. "I promised I'd keep him safe. And he heard me." The beeping from the monitor continued, soft, steady, and impossibly alive. The next hours were a blur of measured urgency. The baby, so small, so impossibly alive, was moved into a neonatal incubator with monitors and a feeding line attached to his fragile frame. Yet every reading confirmed the impossible. His heartbeat was strong, his oxygen levels rising. He was stable. As the sun crept over the horizon, casting a golden hue through the hospital windows, the family remained together, exhausted, battered, but whole. Sarah, her body weak but her heart overflowing, lay with her head resting against Daniel's shoulder. Her voice, a thread of gratitude, whispered, "He needs a name." Daniel, his voice thick with emotion, nodded slowly. "He's a fighter," he said. "He's a miracle." But it was Jaden, his small body curled beside them, his eyes never leaving the incubator, who spoke with certainty. "Elijah," he said softly. "It means, God is my strength." Sarah's lips trembled, and a smile, fragile but true, broke through her tears. "Elijah," she repeated, tasting the name on her lips as if it were a prayer. "Our Elijah." Daniel's hand pressed over Jaden's, his voice breaking. "It's perfect." As the first rays of morning light spilled over the small, sleeping form of their son, a new heartbeat joined their families. A heartbeat that had been lost but returned. And in the quiet, Jaden, his voice soft but full of something infinite, whispered once more, "I promised you, and I always keep my promises." The soft, steady beat of Elijah's heart answered. The soft, steady rhythm of the monitor pulsed in time with the fragile breaths of the newborn cradled within the glass walls of the incubator. Thin wires trailed from his tiny chest, mapping the cadence of his heart, a heart that had been silent but now beat with quiet determination. His skin, dusky and delicate, seemed to glow under the gentle warmth of the incubator's lamp. Daniel sat in a stiff hospital chair, his hand pressed flat against the glass, as if trying to bridge the distance between them. His body ached with exhaustion, but he couldn't look away. His son, their son, was alive. The impossibility of it still rattled him, an ache so sharp and deep it felt like a second heartbeat. Beside him, Sarah rested in her hospital bed, her body weak but her gaze never leaving the incubator. The lines beneath her eyes spoke of suffering, but her expression held something else, an emotion so fierce it could only be called hope. Daniel could feel her trembling through their clasped hands, their fingers entwined, holding on as though letting go would break the spell. The night had been a blur of chaos, alarms, doctors, machines, but through it all, Elijah had clung to life. The room now, though still humming with the soft sounds of machines, felt like a sanctuary. The panic had receded, leaving in its place a fragile, trembling calm. Dr. Miriam entered quietly, her face still etched with the disbelief of what she had witnessed. Yet, now there was something new in her eyes, an ember of cautious hope. She carried a clipboard, but her gaze rested on Elijah's tiny form. She took a breath, her voice calm but firm. "His vitals are improving," she began, flipping briefly through the readings. "His heartbeat is stable, and his oxygen levels are rising on their own. He's still very weak, but—" She paused as if trying to frame something that defied the bounds of medicine. "He's here. And he's fighting." Daniel's voice, rough from hours of silent prayers and tears, broke through. "But how? You said he was—" He couldn't finish. The word tasted too bitter, too final. Dr. Miriam's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't have an explanation," she admitted. "Medically speaking, She hesitated, her professionalism at war with the impossibility of what she had witnessed. He was gone, no heartbeat, no response, but then her eyes flicked to Jaden, who sat quietly by the bedside, his legs curled under him, his eyes still fixed on his brother. "I've seen the kangaroo care method work before," Dr. Miriam continued, her voice softer now, almost reverent. Skin-to-skin contact can stabilize a newborn's heart rate and temperature. It's a powerful tool for premature infants. But this, she shook her head slightly. This was different. He was beyond that point, but then, she looked directly at Jaden. Then he heard you. Jaden's eyes, wide and dark, lifted to hers. His voice, small but certain, carried no confusion, only truth. I told him I'd protect him, he said simply. He knew I was there. The room fell into a hush, the machines beeping softly in time with the steady breaths of the tiny boy who should not have been breathing at all. Daniel felt something in his chest fracture and flood outward, an overwhelming, indescribable gratitude. His hand found Jaden's, and he squeezed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved your brother," he said, his voice raw but filled with something infinite. "You kept your promise." Jaden's gaze dropped, his small fingers tightening around his father's. "I wasn't gonna let him be alone," he whispered. Sarah, her voice weak but thick with emotion, added softly, "You gave him what we couldn't. You gave him your heart." Jaden blinked, his throat tight, but he said nothing, because he knew it was true. He had felt it. In those moments, holding his brother close, he hadn't just given warmth. He had given a promise, a bond. The hours that followed were filled with quiet vigilance. Nurses moved in and out, adjusting machines, checking vitals. The world outside the hospital began to stir, the soft blush of dawn breaking the darkness of the night. But within that room, time felt different. Every beep of the monitor was a victory. Every breath from Elijah's tiny chest was a prayer answered, but the weight of the night still clung to them. Dr. Miriam, ever the realist, kept her voice tempered when she finally spoke again. "He's not out of the woods," she said carefully. "His body went through severe trauma. We need to monitor him closely for the next 48 hours. There could be complications, organ strain, neurological damage. We need to be prepared." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Whatever it takes," he said firmly, "we'll be here." Sarah's voice, soft but steel-threaded, followed. "He's already come back from something impossible," she whispered. "We'll fight with him for as long as it takes." And so they waited. The hours stretched, a slow, anxious vigil. Daniel barely left the chair beside the incubator, and Sarah only closed her eyes when exhaustion dragged her under. Through it all, Jaden stayed close, silent but ever watchful. Then, an alarm. The steady beeping from Elijah's monitor stuttered, then quickened. A nurse rushed in, her face tightening as she read the vitals. "His heart rate is spiking," she called. 102, 110, 130. The panic crashed through the room like a thunderclap. Dr. Miriam was at Elijah's side instantly, her voice sharp. "He's going into tachycardia. His heart's racing too fast." Daniel felt the ground drop from beneath him. "No, no, no," he choked, his body tensing as if he could will his son's heart to slow. Jaden, his own heart pounding in his chest, pressed forward, his voice high and breaking. "What's happening?" Dr. Miriam's voice was urgent but steady. "His nervous system is struggling. It's common after trauma like his. His body is panicking." Jaden felt something hot and desperate burst inside him. Without thinking, he broke from his father's side and rushed to the incubator. The nurses startled, but Jaden's small hands pressed to the glass. "Elijah!" he cried, his voice cracking. "It's okay. You're okay." The monitor still screamed, the erratic peaks and valleys of his brother's heartbeat flashing violently on the screen. But Jaden's hands didn't leave the glass. His voice, thick with tears but fierce with something deeper, cut through the noise. "I'm here," he cried. "I promised you, you're not alone." His voice shook with desperation. "Feel me! I'm right here! Come back to me!" And, impossibly, Elijah's heart began to slow. The wild, spiking rhythm on the monitor stuttered, then began to even out. 130, 120, 110. The beeps softened, the alarm fading. 100, 95, 90. The room, thick with tension, seemed to inhale, then hold its breath. Dr. Miriam's head snapped toward the monitor, her voice a whisper of disbelief. "His heart rate, it's normalizing." The nurse's voice, shaking but clear, followed. "He's stabilizing. Vitals are steady." Silence, and then a tiny, soft sigh from within the incubator. Jaden's small body sagged, his hands still pressed to the glass as tears streamed down his cheeks. His voice, barely audible now, whispered, "I told you, Elijah. I won't leave you. Ever." Behind him, Daniel and Sarah clung to each other, their tears falling freely. Dr. Miriam, her hands still trembling, turned to them with something unreadable in her eyes. "His nervous system responded," she said softly, her voice edged with awe, "but not to the machines, not to the medicine." She turned her gaze fully to Jaden. "He responded to you." The weight of her words settled like something sacred over the room. Jaden, wiping his sleeve across his tear-streaked face, turned back to the incubator. And, as he looked down, Elijah, tiny, fragile, impossibly alive, stirred softly, as if reaching back. The bond, woven in warmth, in whispers and promises, held. And through it, life answered. Daniel's voice, hoarse but sure, filled the quiet. "Our son has his strength." His gaze fell on Jaden, because his brother gave him his heart. And in the soft, rhythmic beat of Elijah's heartbeat, they heard the echo of something unbreakable. A promise kept, a miracle born, and two brothers, forever bound by love. The world beyond the hospital windows had shifted into morning, soft golden light spilling through the glass, casting gentle rays across the sterile floors and walls. The chaos of the night had settled, leaving only a fragile, trembling calm. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors had become a comforting hymn, a steady pulse that told the story of a life that should not have been, but was. Elijah lay in his incubator, his tiny chest rising and falling with every breath, a breath no one had expected him to take. His skin, once pale and lifeless, now carried a warmth, a whisper of vitality. His fingers, so small they could barely curl around a fingertip, twitched slightly, as though even in his dreams he was reaching for something familiar. Daniel sat beside the incubator, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. Exhaustion clung to him, bone deep and unshakable. His body ached, his mind reeled, and his heart felt raw, stretched beyond anything he had ever known. And yet, in the hollow of his exhaustion, there was something else, something bright and aching and beautiful. Hope. Beside him, Sarah lay propped against her pillows, her face pale, but her eyes alight with a fierce, protective love. She was weak, her body still fighting its own battle from the surgery and blood loss, but her gaze never wavered from her son. Every tiny breath Elijah took was a victory, and she counted them all. Jaden sat cross-legged on the chair closest to his brother. His small face, still tear-streaked, was pressed close to the glass of the incubator, his breath fogging the surface slightly. His eyes, wide and dark, tracked every tiny movement Elijah made. His voice, soft but certain, whispered through the thin air, "I told you I'd be here. I'm not going anywhere." The door opened softly, and Dr. Miriam entered, her expression guarded but softer than it had been. She carried a tablet with Elijah's latest vitals and approached the family with careful steps. "Good morning," she said gently. "How are you all holding up?" Daniel lifted his face from his hands, his voice rough from exhaustion. "We're here." Sarah's voice, though weaker, carried a quiet strength. "How is he?" Dr. Miriam's eyes flicked briefly to the incubator before she spoke. "His condition is remarkable," she said, her voice touched with something close to wonder. "His heart is steady. Oxygen levels are holding without additional support. We've removed the ventilator entirely. He's breathing on his own." She paused, and a slow, incredulous smile softened her features. "By every measure, he's stable." A breath that Daniel hadn't realized he was holding escaped him, and he felt Sarah's hand tighten around his, her fingers trembling. "But," Dr. Miriam's voice became more cautious, "we still need to monitor him closely. The trauma he endured, being without oxygen—" She paused delicately, choosing her words with care. "There's a risk of neurological complications. We won't know if there's any damage until we run further tests and observe his development." Silence. The cold edge of fear, so familiar now, slipped back into the room. Sarah's voice, though soft, carried steel. "We'll face whatever comes," she said firmly. "He's already beaten the impossible. We'll fight through anything else." Dr. Miriam's lips pressed into a thin line of respect. "We'll run scans later today. For now." She glanced meaningfully at Jaden, who hadn't moved from his spot at the incubator. "Keep doing what you're doing." She softened. "I think it's working better than anything I can do." Jaden, still leaning close to the glass, didn't take his eyes off his brother. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I told him he wasn't alone." Dr. Miriam's eyes lingered on the boy, a flicker of something rare, something almost sacred, in her usually clinical gaze. "No," she said softly, "he wasn't." As the doctor left, the room fell into a peaceful quiet. Daniel, his body still trembling with exhaustion, turned his eyes back to his son's. His throat felt tight, and when he spoke, his voice was thick and unsteady. "You saved him, Jaden," he said softly. "I don't know how, but you did." Jaden's small shoulders lifted slightly as he whispered, "I just kept my promise." The hours that followed were a slow, tender vigil. Nurses came and went, adjusting machines, checking vitals, but the family remained, a fortress of love and warmth around the fragile life they refused to let go. As the sun crept higher, Elijah stirred again. This time, his tiny fingers, wrinkled and impossibly small, curled slightly, just enough to brush the soft fabric of the blanket. And then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, his fingers opened again and pressed faintly against the glass where Jaden's hand rested. Jaden's breath hitched, his eyes widened, and his voice, thick with emotion, escaped in a whisper. "Daddy!" "He touched me." Daniel's chest tightened, and Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears that spilled freely down her cheeks. "He knows you," she whispered. "He knows his brother." Later that evening, as the sky softened into twilight, Dr. Miriam returned with the results from Elijah's scans. Her face was unreadable, but as she approached the family, there was no shadow of dread, only something careful, something hopeful. "I've reviewed the scans," she said, her voice steady but touched with wonder. "There's no sign of severe neurological damage. His brain activity is normal. Honestly," she hesitated as though the truth felt too large to say aloud, "it's extraordinary. Daniel felt his knees weaken, and he clutched Sarah's hand tightly. "You mean—" His voice cracked, his heart daring to believe. "He's okay," Dr. Miriam finished softly. "As far as we can tell, he's going to be okay." The room fractured into tears, silent, shaking, and unstoppable. Daniel's face pressed into Sarah's hair, his body trembling as relief crashed over him. Sarah's sobs broke from her throat, her lips trembling with gratitude, with something so vast and deep it felt holy. Jaden, his face flushed and damp with tears, pressed his small hands against the incubator once more. "You did it, Elijah," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You stayed with me." A nurse, moved by the scene, stepped forward softly. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. Sarah's breath caught, and she nodded, her whole body trembling. The nurse moved with the utmost care, lifting Elijah from the incubator, his tiny form swaddled in soft blankets, and gently placed him into Sarah's waiting arms. A soft, broken sob escaped her as she felt his warmth, fragile but real. She pressed her lips to his downy forehead, whispering, "My sweet boy, you're here. You're really here." Daniel's arm came around them both, his face pressed against Elijah's small head, his tears warm against his skin. And then, quietly, Jaden approached. His small, tear-streaked face peeked over his mother's arm. Sarah lowered Elijah slightly, and Jaden reached out, a small finger brushing his brother's tiny hand. And then, Elijah's fingers, impossibly small, curled around Jaden's. The bond, forged in warmth and whispers, and the unshakable vow of a brother's heart, held. Jaden, his voice cracking, whispered softly, "I told you, I'd always be here." And Elijah, through that fragile grip, seemed to answer, "I know." The room, filled with the soft light of a new day, stood witness to something that no science could explain and no heart could deny. Not a miracle of medicine, a miracle of love. The hospital felt different in the daylight, warmer, softer, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the miracle that had unfolded within them. The beeping machines, the hushed voices of nurses, even the faint smell of antiseptic seemed less harsh, less cold. The storm had passed. In its place was something fragile but whole, like the sky after rain, washed clean and shimmering with promise. Sarah sat propped up in her hospital bed, her body still weak but her heart full beyond measure. Elijah, swaddled in soft cotton, lay nestled against her chest. His tiny face, peaceful and warm, rested against the heartbeat that had once carried him. She pressed her lips to his downy forehead, inhaling the sweet new scent of him, the scent of life, of second chances. Beside her, Daniel sat with his arm around her shoulders, his other hand resting protectively over Elijah's tiny back. His face, rough with stubble and lined with exhaustion, was softened by something deeper, gratitude that reached his soul. He had felt the cold breath of loss, and now, holding his son against his family, he felt life, vivid, trembling, and precious. And at the foot of the bed, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the mattress, was Jaden. His dark eyes, wide and shining, were fixed on his brother. His small fingers, careful and gentle, reached out to touch Elijah's tiny hand. As if by instinct, Elijah's little fingers curled around Jaden's once more, a silent bond, an unspoken vow. The door creaked softly, and Dr. Miriam entered, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. Her face, so often shielded by professional detachment, now carried something rare, a genuine, open warmth. "How's our little miracle doing today?" she asked softly, her eyes flicking to Elijah's peaceful form. Sarah's voice, though still tired, was rich with love. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He's everything." Dr. Miriam nodded, and her gaze softened as she looked at Jaden. "And how's our hero?" she asked. Jaden's cheeks flushed slightly, and he glanced down shyly. "I'm not a hero," he mumbled. "I'm just his big brother." But Dr. Miriam's voice carried the truth with a gentle finality. "Sometimes, Jaden, being a big brother is the greatest kind of hero there is." Jaden glanced back at Elijah, and his small chest swelled with something deep and certain. "I'll always take care of him," he said quietly. "That's my promise." Dr. Miriam smiled softly. "I believe you," she said simply. 2 weeks later, the day finally came. The air outside was crisp and fresh, and sunlight bathed the world in a golden glow. Daniel carefully wheeled Sarah to the hospital entrance, Elijah cradled in her arms, his tiny face peeking from a soft blanket. Jaden walked proudly beside them, his hand gripping the handle of the car seat they had carefully prepared for his brother. As the automatic doors slid open and the warmth of the world outside greeted them, Daniel paused. He turned to Sarah, his voice thick with emotion. "We're taking him home," he said, as if the words themselves were a blessing. Sarah's eyes, still damp with joy, met his. "Together," she whispered. Jaden, his face beaming with pride, chimed in. "As a family." The drive home felt surreal, a journey they had feared might never happen. But as the familiar streets unfolded before them, each corner and tree painted in the soft hues of spring, it felt like the whole world was welcoming Elijah home. Their house, once so quiet and heavy with anticipation, now felt complete. Sarah settled into the couch, her body still healing but her heart so full it felt weightless. Elijah rested in the bassinet they had prepared months ago, the mobile above him spinning gently, casting soft shadows on the wall. Jaden hovered close, his eyes never straying far from his brother. "Can I?" he asked, his voice soft, his hands uncertain. Sarah smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." Daniel carefully lifted Elijah, his large hands cradling the tiny, precious bundle, and placed him gently into Jaden's waiting arms. Jaden's heart pounded as he felt the warmth of his brother's small body against his own. Elijah's eyes, dark and curious, fluttered open briefly, and Jaden's breath caught. "Hey, little guy," he whispered, his voice full of wonder. "Welcome home." Elijah's tiny mouth opened in a soft yawn, and his little hand, warm and real, rested against Jaden's chest, over his heart. Jaden's voice, quiet but filled with something infinite, followed. "I promised you I'd always be here, and I will, forever." As the weeks passed, life found its rhythm, a rhythm of soft cries, sleepy mornings, and a love that filled every corner of their home. Elijah grew stronger with each day, his tiny hands reaching for the faces that surrounded him with warmth and protection. Jaden became his shadow, his guardian, his playmate, his world. From story time to lullabies, from soft whispers to shared giggles, their bond grew into something unbreakable. And through it all, the family, once brought to the edge of loss, found themselves knitted tighter than ever before, bound by something that defied explanation. Months later, the world outside was bright and alive, and laughter echoed through the backyard. Jaden, now a little taller but still the same boy who had promised with his whole heart, was crouched on the grass beside his little brother. Elijah, now sitting up on his chubby legs, clapped his tiny hands, his wide eyes watching Jaden's every move. Before him was a small, wobbling tower of blocks, one carefully built by his brother. Jaden smiled. "Okay, buddy, you ready? Knock it down." Elijah's tiny hands reached forward, and with an excited squeal, the tower tumbled, blocks scattering across the grass. Jaden laughed, the sound bright and pure. "Good job, Elijah." Elijah's face split into a toothless grin, and then, without warning, he did something new, something extraordinary. He wobbled forward on his little legs and with a soft, breathy voice spoke his very first word. "Jay." Jaden froze, his heart stopping and then bursting all at once. "Did you?" His voice cracked. "Did you just—" Daniel and Sarah, watching from the porch, felt their hearts leap. "Jay," Elijah said again, clearer this time, his tiny arms reaching toward his brother. Jaden's eyes filled instantly, his lips parting in a breathless, joyful laugh. He scrambled forward, pulling his little brother into a careful hug. "That's me," he whispered, his voice trembling with love. "I'm Jay." Elijah's small hand patted Jaden's back, and in that simple touch, small and soft and full of everything, they both knew. The promise had been kept. The promise would be kept forever. And from that moment on, the world knew what Elijah had always known. He wasn't just saved by a miracle, he was saved by his brother. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt tales. Share this video with friends and family who would love it too. And if you're ready for more inspiring stories, check out our other videos. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.